Okay, we are live. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Shannon Q. We have a sort of a special event this evening. So this evening, I am going to be facilitating a debate between our friend RC Apologist and our friend Godless Engineer. So there is a formal structure to this debate. So if you would like to see what the structure of the debate is, it is actually in the description of the video. So I'm not going to take too much time going into it, but we're going to be starting with 20-minute opening statements. If anybody does have any questions that they would like to pose, Super Chat is going to take priority. We are going to be doing that at the end of the formal structure of the debate because both of the participants have agreed on that structure and we're going to adhere to it. I am going to probably not be on video a great deal during this debate because I don't even want my face to have any influence. I want to remain impartial and just respect my responsibilities as the host of this debate. I just offered to be just an impartial platform for this to take place. Now, the subject of the debate is the New Testament reliable? Now, we are going to be starting with RC Apologists, but before we get going, I would like to give each of you an opportunity for, on the off chance that anybody doesn't know who you guys are, and to let some people kind of come on as the stream goes live. We will start with you, RC Apologist. Please introduce yourself and tell people where they can find you.
Well, hello. I'm RC Apologist, your typical Christian apologist, voice actor extraordinaire, as well as just charming lad. But no, in all seriousness, yes, I am RC Apologist, which, by the way, stands for Reformed Christian Apologist, not Roman Catholic Apologist, as some people misplaced and thought that was what that meant. Yeah, you could find me on YouTube. RC Apologist is the channel name where I do theological discussion podcasts, as well as every Friday night, which includes tomorrow, Friday night, Ask RC Apologist, where you can come in for about 3 hours of interrogating me and asking your own questions, whether it be Bible-based or anything else concerning that. So feel free to give me a shout.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Okay, so John, please introduce yourself, just on the off chance nobody knows who you already are, my friend.
So I am John, or Godless Engineer, as a lot of people know me here on YouTube and on Facebook and on Twitter. You can find me all those places with just Godless Engineer. And, I have a YouTube channel that I work tirelessly on. Even when I'm on vacation, I have videos that post. So that happened last week. But yeah, there I just make either, my view on religion and religious videos, or I respond to comments. I have a live stream every Friday night at 8:30 p.m. Central, where we take a look at a video and we respond to some comments and stuff. And we just have a lot of fun. So if you're not subscribed, please go over there and subscribe now.
Awesome. Thank you very much. All right. So now we are going to start the formal portion of the debate. My camera will be off, and RC Apologist, you will have the floor. Please tell us why the New Testament is reliable.
All right. Here we go. So first of all, I would like to thank Shannon for hosting and moderating this particular debate, as well as Godless Engineer for accepting the invitation on this particular thesis. So the thesis that we have is the New Testament reliable, which at a general sense sounds very broad and can go into all kinds of issues concerning the reliability, of which I will go into those. That is concerning textual reliability. That is concerning historical reliability, especially since recently I had gotten a book from Craig Blomberg that's 800 pages long, that's literally just entitled The Historical Reliability of the New Testament. So there is all kinds of subjects that have been debated about any kinds of reliability that go into the New Testament, whether they be from the supporters that are textual critics and scholars, as well as those who are against it and such. I will affirm that it is historically reliable as well as textually reliable to know what is in the New Testament and that it is indeed true. The criteria that I will be used to determine this is using external evidence to determine the authorship and the dating of the New Testament documents, as well as the internal evidence to determine that no significant contradictions in the text of the New Testament documents exist. Now, this will include going over New Testament document manuscripts, which we have access to, that can point out the reliability and the accuracy of the New Testament text, of which we have an accuracy of about 99.5%. So first, let's argue for the reliability of the New Testament being transmitted down, as well as the information about the authorship, which first let's deal with the memory. Now, some people would say that concerning memory, it's like telephone game, one person relays the story down. Since it took several years till the Gospels get written down, how are they going to memorize all this stuff that would have been onward, as well as the manuscripts that eventually get copied over and over and over? So some people would say that, it's like a game of telephone. However, in the ancient Greco-Roman world, this was not the case. It was so important in that ancient world and in that ancient context for memory that, according to the study on this by Mary Carruthers, she says the following on page 14 in the Book of Memory, quote, "A person without memory, if such a noble thing would be a person without moral character, and in a basic sense, without humanity." So in other words, it was so common, as well as forced and instructed, especially during the time of education at that point, for someone to have good memory skills, that if you were without it, you were basically like the odd one out. That was how important it was. And in fact, even specifically narrowing down in the Jewish context for Jesus, the Talmud describes that a child's mind should be like a well-plastered cistern that is able to not let a single drop of water escape. And this is why we have instances where, for example, you have the Jewish people able to recognize and remember and cite the entire Torah, especially at a young age. So, and not just in concerning that, let's go over the entirety of it. You have them developing ancient memory techniques that would allow them to train the memory to remember things, especially for memorizing the entire Torah, as I mentioned. And in the case of Gentiles, like Quintilian, to memorize entire speeches that were hours long. So the problem with objecting to this, if this does become a case, is the fact that, this culture is different than ours. We don't put so much of an emphasis on memory as they did back then. And that's why we have different techniques and strategies for education and memorization skills. And they obviously had theirs. To judge another culture in light of ours would be to be committing an cultural and intellectual snobbery and say that our culture is superior to theirs in terms of the way they were able to formalize and do their own skills. So let's go over the issue of some of the New Testament authorship of the books. Now, for sake of time, we will only have a chance to go over a couple that I think is important over the matter. So first, we're going to go towards Irenaeus in France in his book Against Heresies. Book 3 states that all 4 Gospels are authored by their attributed authors based on the tradition that he would have received this from, which would have been his teacher Polycarp. And Polycarp was a disciple of the Apostle John himself. And so, remember, Irenaeus is in France. So we also have Tertullian, North Africa, Clement of Alexandria and Papias, and Hierapolis, which cite the same info. And then you have the Muratorian fragment, which again gives us the same attribution towards these particular names. So if you put these sources on a map of the writing of when they wrote these letters, and note that they're in various corners of the early church world, there is a wide attestation and attribution of these particular Gospels and their supposed authors. So those are some things to keep in mind and consideration. Another will go towards the Gospel of John. Let's focusing on the dating specifically, since Gospel of John is the last Gospel and is most definitely the controversial and latest of the Gospels. It is stated to have remained for John. John was remaining with the Asian elders at Ephesus until the time of Trajan in 98 AD by testimony of both Clement of Alexandria and Irenaeus. So we have this so far being the date of his life based on these accounts. Now, regarding him living to that span in terms of his years, Craig Blomberg notes in page 161 of his book that I mentioned earlier, The Historical Reliability of the New Testament, says, quote, "Since Jews were considered adults by the age of 12 or 13, a self-styled rabbi like Jesus could have selected anyone younger than him down to the age of 14 or so to be his disciple. If John were as young as 17 after Jesus' 3 years of ministry in AD 30, he would have been only 85 in 98 AD. a very conceivable lifespan. Now, of course, we don't actually accurately know what age John was during the time that he was chosen, but if we can go by the estimate of what's going on here in AD 98 with him being alive, we can at least still make an estimated guess that's educated. Now, the dating, of course, can be tricky, and so, as D.A. Carson notes in page 2140 of his Zondervan Study Bible of the NIV, and this will be the last thing we'll go over for that, if we must suggest a date for which John wrote the fourth gospel, we may very tentatively advance 80 to 85. One of the many reasons for this, now here's the reasons, don't just simply accept the quote by itself, is to allow for some time between the writing of John's gospel and the writing of his 3 letters, which were probably written in the early 90s and which combat an incipient form of Gnosticism and respond in part to a Gnostic misunderstanding of the fourth gospel. And of course, Michael J. Kruger in the Biblical Theological Introduction to the New Testament states, we would not expect John to have been written immediately after AD 70. It would have taken some time for the impact of the temple's destruction to result in mature theological reflection about the relationship between Jesus and the temple. In addition, John's more explicit language regarding the divinity of Jesus fits more closely with what we see in Ignatius and thus suggests a date toward the end of the first century. So these are just some things to keep in mind concerning this. Now, of course, I have more information about all the different dating and authorship attributions of the New Testament epistles, but if we have time to go over that in the rebuttal and the cross-examination, then we shall surely do so for that. So, that being said, another thing to consider for the criteria here is the criteria of embarrassment for the New Testament. This means that if a story seems embarrassing or unlikely for somebody to invent as something to pass off as true for their own purposes, of which we may not know of or do know of, its credibility is to be considered. It doesn't necessarily follow, though, that it is proven true alone by that. So don't take this to mean that just because something fits this criteria automatically makes it true. Just something to consider along with the rest of what I have to say. Now, some examples that meet this criteria of embarrassment is the classic example of the women who found the tomb empty. Why use only women in all 4 Gospels when given a chance to recount this tale of when they would go? So, because the one thing we know is that women's testimony was considered unreliable. In fact, in the Talmud itself, it even mentions that, a woman's testimony is not reliable. And in fact, Josephus, to help enlighten on Jewish understanding from that particular century as well as the second, so very close in the culture, Josephus in Antiquities of the Jews, Book 4, Chapter 8 says, "But let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the inconstancy and presumption of their sex." So he's saying that just because of their sex, just because of their gender, their testimony is to be dismissed. But yet, the people that had come up with this, that supposedly were to invent this up out of thin air, used women for this account. That would be the most terrible way to try to get something that you invented off the ground and be convinced by people, if you're going to start with the idea of using women, especially if your audience is going to also be Jewish for the first part of carrying out this ministry. And also the Rosh Hashanah in Talmud chapter 1, as I stated earlier, that's where you can find the particular thing, says that a woman's testimony was considered unreliable. So, again, not saying that this is evidence, but it does make you wonder, why would they do this? Why, make this up as some kind of conspiracy? So, all the different conspiracy theories about, say, specifically also the resurrection account, this blows the conspiracy theory, at least, out of the others, out of the water. Now, another one is the healing of a blind man. This is one not a lot of people think about. Is Mark chapter 8, verses 22 to 26, where Jesus goes to heal a blind man. Other instances, you have Jesus able to, at a snap of his fingers, immediately was able to heal somebody. He was able to heal the lame and resurrect somebody. Remember Lazarus? He was just able to go and whisper and tell him to get up, and boom, Lazarus was resurrected. But however, in the case of Jesus with the blind man, he had to spit on him and use saliva to heal the man. Why not just say, put his hand on him and boom, resurrect, and he's, cured of his blindness? Why also a lowering of the amazement of the miracles. He, one, has to use saliva. Secondly, has to ask again, what do you see? Because the first time he asked, what do you see? He said, I see men that are walking like trees, or see trees that walk like men. So then he has to press his hands on his eyes again and then ask, what do you see? So it has like a time lapse, if you will, of when it works, instead of when most cases, like the layman, that he was, just able to get up and walk. It didn't take no 1 or 2 days or 30-minute progression and waiting period. It took immediately. But yet we have one instance here that can fit the criteria of embarrassment concerning Jesus still able to work miracles, and they work differently. They don't all of a sudden work instantaneously and spontaneously. Now, my favorite my favorite study for this topic is New Testament textual criticism. And here's the reason why. First of all, we can know for certainty what was in the biblical text that we have that we are using for this debate. Concerning the New Testament manuscript documents, we have at least, this is just at least 5,800 Greek manuscripts. For the Latin manuscripts, we have at least 10,000. For other languages, we have within at least 5,000 to 10,000 for these variants. And that also considers the church father quotes, which, according to some estimates, say about 1 million. But as I'm not going to necessarily say that that's actually factual. One thing that has been noted by Dr. Daniel Wallace, especially in his debate with Dr. Bart Ehrman, and even this was attested by Bart Ehrman himself in a book he wrote with Bruce Metzger, that if you were to just take the church father quotes alone, with the church father quotes alone, and we just lost all the manuscript documents that was stated earlier, you could reconstruct the entire New Testament on church father quotes alone. So considering all these, this is actually pretty good, considering, again, as I mentioned, for the other manuscripts, for the Greek language in the original, that's 5,800. Homer's Iliad has 1,757 manuscripts at least for it. And then Suetonius goes even lower with only at least 200 manuscripts. And then there's the dating of the earliest of the manuscript, of which we can go towards the original reading to see which is which. For that, you have the New Testament, which is like at least 70 years apart, depending on which New Testament document you want to get into. Then you have 300 years for the complete manuscripts. So you have, for example, Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus. Those are the complete New Testament manuscript documents. So those come 300 years. But even concerning the fragments we have, those are 70 years apart for the New Testament. So P76, P45, all these other different fragments that we have that are definitely early of these manuscripts are very reliable. And we have, again, as Daniel Wallace and others note, an embarrassment of riches of these. But let's go to the others. So again, 70 to 300 years for manuscripts of the New Testament. Take a look at Tacitus. And
5 minutes.
All right, thank you there. Tacitus, the early manuscript of the Annals of History, doesn't appear until the 9th or 10th century. The Gallic Wars by Julius Caesar, that's not until the 9th century. And Suetonius is at least 800 years apart from its supposed original composition. So concerning the earliest going back towards its original period versus the earliest manuscript we have, the New Testament is certainly reliable in terms of the textual things that we have there. Now, next is textual variants. Now, some people see this as a problem. Some people see this as actually strong supporting evidence for the reliability. We can use these to do a critical examination and reconstruct what the original text was. As of now, of course, concerning this, in 2016, this is before it was stated, about 400,000, but there are 140,000 words in the New Testament. As of 2016, there exists 500,000 textual variants that are in existence. This means a difference of textual variation. So this can even be something like potato, or saying star with a 1 R and star with 2 R's. That alone is considered a textual variation, even if it's just a spelling mistake or anything like that. And so out of these, I will share this quick little thing, making sure that I get the time as well. Luckily, I always have my phone on set for timer. All right. So concerning these are to be kept in mind about. Okay, we have all these variants. So what kind of variants are we dealing with? So you have right here, now again, disregard the number because 400,000 was before the year 2016. 2016 is when we discovered there were 500,000. So even then, try to work with the guess numbers that we have at this point. At least 75% of these differences, of these variants, are nothing more than spelling errors or differences. These exist in other books of manuscripts that we have out there today. So the majority is just simply spelling errors or differences that don't really affect the text as much. Next is 15%, which are variations in Greek synonyms and transpositions. Again, not so much a relevant issue. These happens all the time concerning the vast majority. By the fact that we have a lot of the manuscripts, we can easily figure out which is the original reading out of all these manuscript variants. Now, you have 9% that are late changes. In other words, these are definitely changes that occur, but they're much later. So, for example, you could have like Mark 16, verses 9 through 20, John chapter 7, verse 53 to 11, 1 John 5, 7, all these that are coming much later than when the earliest manuscripts come in. Now, only 1% exist that do affect the meaning of the text and are from early manuscripts, but even as Bart Ehrman notes, these do not affect essential Christian doctrine. These just simply can mean a difference in meaning, but at the same time, the application is still the very much same. Now, I only have like about a minute and 40 seconds on my clock here, so I'll just simply end with this. That we have so far, I haven't gone over all the things that I wanted to get off my chest about this, but I will say this. The New Testament is not only historically reliable based on what we've gone over, but also textually reliable based on evidence of internal and external critiques that we can examine. Now, hopefully, during the rebuttal, we can get into some of the external sources. But in order for my opponent to settle this issue for his side, he will have to prove that concerning historically and textually, if these things are unreliable for the New Testament. So I hope and wish Godless Engineer the best of luck on that. And with that, I end my time.
Awesome. Thank you. And you have a minute left. Well done. Well done. All right. So just to let people know, we did have a super chat, so there will be questions at the end. So please don't get upset if I don't ask them right away. I want to make sure that I'm respecting the time that was agreed upon. So now it will be John's turn. So John, I am going to give the floor to you if you are ready. Are you ready, my friend?
Yes.
Yes. All right, sir. Go right ahead.
All right, so what's up, heathens and non-heathens out there? Today we are here to discuss the reliability of the New Testament, but what does it mean to be reliable? Reliability is the quality of being trustworthy or dependably performing a task that was intended to perform. In engineering, we use the probability that something will fail to calculate exactly how reliable a system is. So today I hope to show you how the New Testament has a high probability of failure to reliably communicate history and theology, rendering it substantially unreliable. I have big words. I will do this by examining the failure to communicate the original message of the source documents through textual criticism between our earliest Greek manuscripts and those that were later codified into the Bible. I will present examples of how the message was altered, both in large and small aspects, and how that changes the message of the text. I will also show how the New Testament cannot be trusted as a reliable historical document or documents, however you want to consider it. Not only comparing the Gospels to one another, but also showing how whole books have been forged to make historical claims. So first, we're going to get into the textual criticism, which I am so glad that both RCA and I identified the best ways to prove or disprove reliability, because, I mean, his points I've hit on as well for the most part. So I'm going to present an overview of textual criticism as far as my side goes, but don't take me as an expert opinion. I have sources that I can give to Shannon later, and you guys can go and look for yourself, because I've actually got a list of a majority of the textual variations, additions, and omissions from various codexes and Greek manuscripts that we have. But essentially, what I want to point out in this section is that scribal interpolation and miscopying happened abundantly in the early days of transcribing the source material, as it was easier to change at that point in time and be accepted amongst the people. As time progresses, we see the New Testament stabilize in general, but what we don't have is the first couple hundred years of manuscripts which to compare to. We do know that interpolations and transcriptions errors were abundant in the 500 years after our earliest extant codex. It's unreasonable to assume that it jumped from perfect transcription to pure anarchy. The majority of the transcription errors and additions were spelling errors and interpolations, which I can see RCA and I both agree with. And I agree with his numbers there. But what I would caution is that these do not need to be easily dismissed. For instance, in Matthew 6:6, it has pray to your Father in secret or pray to your Father who is in secret, depending on which copy you read. These have different messages and thus change the meaning of what was said. These types of differences are abundant in the Bible and in general, but inserting entire verses and pericopes were also common when transcribing. These were inserted to suit theological needs of the transcriber. In Mark 1:2, you have some sources that say in prophets, while others say in Isaiah the prophet or in Isaiah prophet. These are obviously two different things, as one is vague and the other is an inaccurate citation for the whole prophecy that comes following that statement about John the Baptist. Luke 23:34 was once omitted from Luke altogether. This was the famous prayer, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And some transcribers were anti-Semitic and thought that Jesus shouldn't forgive the Jews that killed him. They did this for theological purposes. Matthew 9:26 either says this report, or this report of him, or this report of her, or the same report. And I would consider changing the gender of who you're talking about, or even the whole person in general, to be pretty significant change. Now, there are other larger interpolations that happen while transcribing. For instance, in the early 2nd century, we know that a transcriber added a new ending to Mark that seemed to attempt to harmonize it with the other Gospels by adding post-resurrection appearances. We know this because it's simply not there in our earliest sources for Mark. Most Bibles now denote that these verses were most likely added, but they are still there. Harmonization was the most common reason for adding new information to the manuscripts. 1 Corinthians 14:34-35 has Paul's famous "women should be silent" line, and that is considered a later interpolation. We know this because it deviates from Paul's overall message regarding women, as well as the fact that the verses appear in different order in other copies of the text. In some copies of the text, it appears at the 34-35. Other copies, it appears after verse 40. This is a classic indication of interpolation. In the Gospel of John, we have the pericope of the adulteress that was inserted, and there are hundreds of other examples that you can find that highlight these type of additions to the manuscripts that we have. There are also whole books forged in the name of authors like Peter. 2 Peter is a forgery made to give a direct encounter with an earthly Jesus because people were saying that the Messiah is just a cleverly devised story. The linguistic differences, use of Jude, the allusions to Gnosticism, Jesus having not returned yet, and little to no external support for the work are what kind of indicate a forgery. This work is dated to the early to middle 2nd century. If you disregard all the evidence that I just pointed out, it could have been written earlier, but you would need to explain all of the differences and all of the reasons why it's considered a forgery now. You would need to explain those. My point here is that the textual variants, interpolations, and flat-out additions to the Bible were rampant in the time frame that we can know for sure, and that they were happening. And there's no reason to think that it didn't happen as bad, if not worse, in the time frame that we just simply don't have any sources for. Simple fact is, we don't know what was originally written in the source documents, but we can be assured that it's not what we ended up with. Now, the next I want to touch on historical reliability. As you know, I'm a mythicist, but I'm going to try to keep that kind of out of this particular debate. But I do want to start on a point of agreement. There are some aspects of the New Testament that are historical, like mentioning Pilate, Quirinius, Herod, as well as specific places that we definitely know exist or existed at that time. Now, just because it gets minor things right does not mean that overcomes the non-historical nature of whatever's in the Bible. Now, my first contention is the obvious difference between the Gospels and the New Testament. They seem to be at odds with one another from the beginning to the end. Only 2 Gospels record the birth narrative, and those Gospels are extrapolations on Mark, which has no birth narrative. The 2 birth narratives are at odds with each other. Matthew prefers using a mirror of the Moses narrative, with Jesus being born and whisked away to Egypt because the ruler Herod ordered the slaughter of the Jewish children 2 years or younger, which this slaughter has its own problems in history, being that it isn't recorded at all in history other than in this one instance. There were historians recording things that Herod did, and if they had problems with Herod killing 2 of his kin, which happened, then the needless slaughter of young children would have definitely made the radar in some way. After the exile in Egypt, Jesus came back to the area. However, Luke goes a totally different route of having a worldwide census being called by it was like the Caesar of the time or whatever. I can't remember his name right now. But that happened during the reign of Quirinius, and he ordered people to go back to their, not Quirinius, the Caesar, ordered people to go back to their ancestral home from 1,000 years ago. But this never happened. Oh, and I forgot to mention that Herod died in 6 BCE, while Quirinius didn't take power until, hold on. Herod died in 4 BCE, while Quirinius didn't take power until 6 AD. So there's a 10-year difference in these birth narratives. So not only do you have substantially different ideas about how Jesus was even born, that's not even to mention the actual manger and or being born in a, I believe it was a house in one of them or something like that. That's not even counting those particular differences, but just the entire time frame of both are completely removed from each other. Now, when Jesus enters Jerusalem, when he's coming to, die for the sins of everybody, did he ride in on 1 jackass or 2? It depends on which gospel you read, because each writer is interpreting prophecies of Jesus in different ways. One had him writing in on 1, while another interpretation had him writing in on 2. This is a clear indication that they were not recording history. They were creating a theological narrative. The way that Pilate is portrayed in the Bible is antithetical to the actual Pilate of history. The Pilate of history once had his men dress as Jewish protesters and slaughter them on his command. He did not care about killing Jews. He was actually taken out of his position because he slaughtered some other religious group. He wouldn't have been pushed around by the Jewish elders, and he wouldn't have been so unsure about killing some Jew. This, again, is a theological change, because it had to be the Jewish elders that pushed Jesus to be crucified instead of being stoned like their laws would have demanded. He also wouldn't have given the people a choice to either let a Roman prisoner go or some random fucking Jew. This whole choice debacle was in a reenactment of the Yom Kippur ritual, where one sacrifice is let go, carrying off the sins of Israel, while another one is sacrificed. This is exactly what Jesus Barabbas and Jesus represented. Again, this is a theological change, and thus proves they weren't actually recording history, because I'm fairly certain Pilate would have just killed the both of them. Then going on to Jesus being crucified. Of course, natural events in the Bible that supposedly took place at this time never actually did take place, like the eclipse, the earthquake, the dead rising, walking around. There is no corroborating evidence for any of these things. And we can actually backtrack eclipses to know when they would have happened in the first century. And there's no evidence from any historians that were recording natural events at the time that an earthquake took place. So these natural events in the Bible were obviously not historical and merely theological. The Gospel of John has a Jesus dying on a completely different day than the other Gospels. He does this for theological reasons because in his Gospel, he wants to portray Jesus as this sacrificial lamb. So he has Jesus killed when the lambs are being slaughtered for Passover. This is because he is the Lamb of God, and John, or the author of John rather, wanted to portray him exactly as that. Another obvious contention, not that I haven't listed a lot of them already, is the way that Jesus' tomb was supposedly found. Each gospel has its own version of this, and each version draws on different interpretations of different Old Testament scripture. The number of women who find the tomb are different. The number of guards guarding the tomb change. What was exactly found in the tomb? How did the tomb get opened exactly? These are all major differences that cannot just be wiped away from just being different perspectives. I mean, in Mark, you have the women finding the tomb empty with a young man inside. And in Matthew, an angel descends from the heavens, bitch slaps the tombstone, and proclaims Jesus is risen before bolting his ass back up into heaven. In Luke, 2 men are found inside the tomb, and an unnamed group of women. In John, Mary Magdalene just finds the tomb empty and then runs off to tell all of the disciples. These are not different perspectives. These are completely different stories, and they all have theological reasons for being there. They all have theological reasons behind them for the people that wrote them, for them to write them that way. So that's a clear indication that it's not history, it is theology. Most of the content in the New Testament is going to be theological, and very limited amount of historical claims are made. The historical claims and facts within the Bible are nearly always incorrect, and the minor factual things it gets right are not enough to offset the unreliable nature of the historical claims in the Bible. Now, next I want to touch on theological reliability, and the theological reliability is going to be based on our previous two measurements that we have. The Bible cannot be theologically reliable considering the textual reliability and the fact that we can't know what ideas the original source documents espoused. We do know that Paul was our first writer in the New Testament, and his Jesus did not have a ministry on earth.
5 minutes.
As far as we know from Paul's writings. Mark is the closest gospel to Paul, and he goes a step further and places Jesus on earth. The other gospels further round out the edges of the theology contained within Jesus' teaching in Paul, but not even Paul's writings are sacred to the early transcribers. I mean, as we saw earlier, Paul's writings were altered later to send certain messages, like demeaning the role of women in the early church. We see stories and even whole books being created and inserted into the Bible in order to teach separate things. Each gospel's focus on different aspects of Jesus, and the fact that there are several times in the Bible you are warned of false preachers. Paul goes and verifies with other apostles in Galatians that he's teaching the correct version of the theology. All of this coalesces into the fact that in the formation of the Christian religion, we have a variable landscape of ideas being tossed out. And what we have now is what we're stuck with after things started to stabilize. We know what changed in the 400 to 500 years of the early church after our extant manuscripts, but we don't know how much of it changed and is lost to history prior to that. Is the Bible's theology reliable? Multiple anonymous authors with thousands of transcription errors, additions, subtractions, and such would seem to indicate that you can't trust the theology contained within the Bible to be a good representation of what was actually taught for those first 200 years of the church's history. We can't reliably know if it contains the theology from Christians of 300 to 600 AD, or if it contains the original theology that of those that were alive in the first century. It simply just isn't reliable. It's not reliable historically, theologically, or even textually. So I know I have a little bit of time here, and I wrote down some notes from RCA's thing, and I'll just talk out my time a little bit. He mentioned that there's a lot of copies, which he seems to indicate that indicates that it seems to be reliable or whatnot. But in actuality, most of those are copies of copies of copies of copies. So what you have to do is you have to take the actual extant codexes and manuscripts and papyri and everything like that are not just these multiple copies of copies of copies. These aren't original documents, mind you. These themselves are copies of copies of copies of copies, but they're the earliest copies that we have of these manuscripts. And of course, we do have the church fathers. I mean, that's part of the reason why we know that the ending in Mark was added sometime in the 2nd century. And then let's see. RCA indicated that apparently in the Bible, one of the embarrassments or whatnot is Jesus being weak. And what I would say to that is that Mark is a very early gospel. It's the first gospel. Of course, I'd take Mark in priority, but in it's the first gospel, and therefore Jesus is portrayed as being weaker. I mean, not only is that portion the blind man was spitting in the eye and rubbing the dirt in it. We not only have that, but also there's a particular portion early in Mark where he went to a town and he could do no miracles there. And so that shows how he is weaker, I guess, as a god. But what we see is that the progression in the Gospels as they're being written makes them even more magical as it gets on into Luke, and even more powerful. So I would say that particular criterion of embarrassment isn't good. And I would say in general, the criterion of embarrassment is not good, because we do not know what was embarrassing to the 1st century Jews, but we do know that which survives now must at least not have been embarrassing to the Jews, because they had more than enough opportunities, as I presented in my 20-minute first introduction thing here, showing that they had multiple chances in which to change this.
You guys both had almost exactly the same time. You had 1 minute left as well. Juicy. Good job, everybody. Fantastic. All right. So now we are going to move on to the rebuttals. So the first 10-minute rebuttal is going to go to RC Apologist. So please go ahead, take the floor. You have 10 minutes.
All right. So I make sure to also take some notes as well. There's one thing me and G share in common concerning this. So let's go ahead and go over some of the points that my opponent mentioned. Now, first thing was mentioned that, scribal interpolations did occur, and I wouldn't deny this, and I don't think any well-educated Christian denies that there was indeed textual corruption and textual interpolations that occurred, and we would also agree there is no perfect transmission, but, as is pointed out, that we can have an accuracy of at least 99.5% concerning the text, with textual criticism and the problems that have been solved with it. So while it's not perfect, it is most definitely accurate and reliable in terms of what has been pointed out earlier. Now, some of the verses that was mentioned was Matthew chapter 6, verse 6, which is the issue of pray to your Father in secret, or pray to your Father who is in secret. Now, I mentioned earlier that some of these textual variants that exist, and this could, again, be part of the 1%, which, again, just to keep in mind for some of those who might be on my side, that 1% would include at least 1,000 different textual variants that do change a bit of the meaning of the text. But is this change in the meaning really anything that affects Christian theology? I don't see how, because if you have it in one way, it says, pray to your Father in secret, okay, affecting the behavior and showing the behavior of how one is to, go about and pray in secret. And we could have other passages that are found within the Bible that can display this same issue. Then it's Matthew chapter 6, verse 6, pray to your Father who is in secret. This would be something just, talking about God who is, we can't see him and he's in secret, but however, the issue is, again, focusing on his omnipotence. So both of these would not contradict historic Christian theology. So I don't think this would be a good argument to use concerning this. And I think that we can use and point that both of these variants, the theology of this, can be found elsewhere within the Bible. Now, of course, I wasn't able to look into, because I don't have a critical edition of the New Testament to look into the different textual variants to see if one of these two passes a grading scale of accuracy over the other. But if you ever decide to, if you go online or you get one for yourself, whether it be the Nessialan 28 or 29, since it's getting revised, as well as the United Bible Society critical edition of the New Testament, you can see the grading scale of which of these should be considered more accurate over the other in terms of variance. Next is Father, forgive them, in Luke chapter 23, verse 34. It is indeed not part of the original, and I don't think, again, this shows any form of unreliability. We just know that back then they didn't have that, and then someone eventually at some point added it in. So I want to know what the original wrote in that, because we have textual criticism and the various manuscripts, we are able to discover that, okay, this isn't part of it. So again, this is not debunking the reliability, since we now have for sure knowing this is not part of the original, but rather we have what is in the original. But I do have to propose one question. Correct me if I'm wrong during your rebuttal, but it seems to suggest that this was removed because of possible that, why should Jesus forgive them? So that there's some possible anti-Semitism that is involved in this, of the reason why it was supposedly removed or why it wasn't in there or whatnot. I would like to understand what was meant by that comment about the anti-Semitic thing there. Another is the issue of Paul saying, let the women be silent, is considered an interpolation. Now, I've agreed that there are textual variants that have existed in Matthew 6:6 and in Luke 23, verse 34. But I have yet to hear of the textual variant of let the woman be silent. So if you could, in your rebuttal, provide a manuscript that contains a textual variation of let the woman be silent, or if let the woman be silent is missing in any manuscript. In other words, can we have a manuscript of the place and the location of this, where it would be, and it's lacking? I would like to know what manuscript lacks this. Now, this was mentioned in one video that I've seen of his, and I have wanted to go over this for quite some time, and I've done so actually against a Muslim a while back in a podcast episode. But it is 2 Peter. Is 2 Peter indeed a forgery, like some people say? In fact, this is even the majority consensus view. That was funny though, because the first debate we had, I was in the majority consensus and Godless was in the minority, and now the roles have kind of reversed in this debate. But for this particular thing here, I want to go over why I believe it is reliable to view it as the author to be Peter. For one, not just because he writes his name as Peter, and we have good reason to believe that the dating is within his time period. The assertions that are made as to why this is a forgery is, well, stylistic, language differences, and all that stuff. But as is noted by Simon J. Keistmaker in his contribution to the Biblical Theological Introduction to the New Testament, here are some examples. Quote, first, some stylistic changes may be attributed to the input of an individual scribe or secretary whose methods and work habits differed from others. And so, as he eventually goes to note on, that different scribes were able to do this, and they even revealed themselves in sometimes these epistles, like Romans 16:22 identifies that the scribe who writes on behalf of the name of Paul is indeed Tertius. And then for 1 Peter, the other Peter before this one, is from Silvanus or Silas, as stated in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 12. So again, it could be part of the different style of the specific scribe that is writing on behalf of them. So the authorship is still towards the person, but they are using a scribe, and sometimes the people weren't literate enough to write. So as Bart Urban notes, everyone in the ancient world, if they weren't literate, they could at least have scribes and afford and pay for scribes to dictate their letters. Second, as Keistmaker points out, as an author's circumstances and subject matter that can affect his writing style and vocabulary. These two epistles were written at varying times and in substantially different circumstances.
3 minutes.
Thank you. And so concerning Second Peter's subject, it was darker than First Peter's, focusing on false teachers, the second coming, God's impending judgment. And third is the difference between them not overshadowing the number of striking parallels, such as is highlighted in this particular commentary chart. Then in First and Second Peter, you have the inspiration of the Old Testament, doctrine of election, the doctrine of the new birth, the need for holiness, the sinful angels in prison, Noah and his family are protected, immorality and judgment, exhortation to Christian living, and doxology. So those are just a few reasons why I believe we can still view this as not a forgery, but rather that it is still from Peter and it still shares similarities, most certainly, with Peter, and that it's not just simply the differences are essential. This definitely took a lot more time than I thought. But I do want to go over one thing. He says that, the gospel records, in two of them, records the birth narrators, but another doesn't. Well, why should the other one record it all the time? Because sometimes they're focusing on their intended goal. Matthew, for example, was written in the Hebrew dialecto. He was written in terms that Jews would understand. So Matthew's gospel was definitely for a Jewish audience. John's gospel is written for Christians that are already believers in Christ. Then you have Mark that's written for a Gentile audience. And then you have Luke that's written definitely for a more skeptical as well as still, again, Gentile audience, writing it as a historical perspective and also writing specifically to Theophilus, which is mentioned in Luke chapter 1. But if we're going to do this where it says, well, why did also, for example, the slaughter ordered by Herod, of the babies and such, why didn't no other account write of this? Why is it just written in here? Well, again, this should not be reason to doubt it, because again, I'm going to name two instances where we have something like this happen. Pliny the Elder is the only one who writes of the Pompeii incident. Now, of course, we have archaeological evidence of Pompeii, but why is Pliny the only one that write about this and attributes that it's the Pompeii volcano that erupted? He only wrote about it because he had a relative that was there in the incident. But nobody else wrote about Pompeii, and it was this huge event. Then you have Josephus in his Antiquities that records the slaughter of Jews, not the same thing, obviously, but writes the slaughter of Jews that was ordered by Herod and that there was a canceling of the Passover. But again, Josephus is the only one who records this. If we would truly be skeptical, we must say that the account Josephus writes and the account Pliny wrote in detail is not reliable. Now, I don't have much time to go over some of the other stuff, so hopefully we can go over some of the other notes I have in the cross-examination, and with that, I end my time. Oh, you're still muted.
Not used to not talking. Can't figure out the operations. So the next 10 minutes are going to go to John. So you had about 10 seconds left. So good work. All right. John, are you ready?
Yep.
All right. Let me white box you and please go ahead.
Okay. I would have to say, starting from, RCA's opening and progressing forward, I'll try to get to some of your questions that you had there in your rebuttal, RCA. Just starting from the top here, I think that I proved, that there are at least some contradictions in the Bible, at least enough contradictions in order to say that, that the Bible isn't reliably telling history, and it's more created for theological reasons, which, I mean, you so much as said just now that, the gospel writers were writing for intended audiences. They were writing for a certain theology that they wanted to tell about Jesus. So also, you talk about memory, and you talk about how they were transcribed like 99% accurately or whatnot, and you say that they had perfect memory or near perfect memory, and I would have to really disagree with that, considering the fact that there's a lot of memory tricks that are worked into the Bible, which I know that you mentioned they had certain tricks for memorizing things, but I mean, these are like common things to get people to remember stuff, like, the triple repeating of information, you're going to tell you're going to announce what you're about to tell somebody, you're going to tell somebody what you meant to tell them, and then you recap it by telling them what you just told them. These are common memory tricks that everybody knows and doesn't necessarily need a perfect memory in order to learn these or use these. So I don't understand why you would say just assume that they had a perfect memory. You use the Talmud a lot in order to justify this, but the Talmud was written much, much later. And, I don't think that you can really use that in order to verify things happening in the first century. And then, you started citing a whole bunch of early church fathers, but what I would say to the early church fathers and them citing like authorship and everything like that is, well, for one thing, the authorship of each one doesn't really affect any of the arguments that I've used here tonight, at least in my opinion. But also, these particular early church fathers didn't write or didn't say anything until like the middle 2nd century on into the 3rd century sometimes. So I would say that those aren't reliable sources in which to say, oh, yes, these people wrote them. And then you say that John supposedly could have lived to about 87 years old when the average lifespan of a 1st century person was about 48 years. Now, granted, if you were an aristocrat and you were living a pretty healthy life, you probably could have made it much further along. But you also have to understand that the people writing these particular manuscripts, while we don't know who they are, we do know that they weren't exactly at the top of the food chain at that point. You talk about the criterion of embarrassment, and I like that you stated, "Oh, hey, you can't really know," or this doesn't allow you to say that it definitely happened, but it's something to think about. And I would follow that up with, legally nowadays you have to have supporting information in order to support an embarrassment testimony, something that would be embarrassing to the person. You have to actually support it with actual evidence. Also, you use the criterion of embarrassment for the finding of the tomb. Like, why would they have women? Well, for one thing, if they wanted to change it, they definitely could have. If not in the first couple hundred years that we don't have manuscripts for, but definitely in the next 500 years in which people were adding and omitting things. And you kind of cite the Talmud again. That's really out of date in order to do things like that. Okay, so my point in the textual criticism portion wasn't that a lot of changes were made to change the theology that we can detect from like the 200 period on. It was just that people were changing it. People were knowingly changing it. I presented information that showed that they were changing information. They were adding and omitting things in order to push specific messages. And so that was my point in it. I don't think that you need a lot, like an unsurmountable amount of changes that were significant in order to at least throw caution and doubt onto whether or not you can trust, the what's in the Bible. And I think showing that, these substantial changes did actually happen, and the fact that we don't know what was changed before our earliest extant codexes and manuscripts, I think that should give you enough doubt to be like, well, we can't really rely on it to be reliable. And you asked about the anti-Semitic mark. I believe I got this from Bart Ehrman. And I rarely like to name drop, but in preparation for this, I was going over a lot of material, and he mentions this and mentions how it makes sense if the person was anti-Semitic and wanted to edit that particular part out. And it's not that it was like it was added in or anything like that. It's that we have early manuscripts that have it in there, and then in some manuscripts it's taken out and then put back in there. So I think that's covered in the links that I have, so I can send you those later. The let the women be silent passage, you were wondering in which versions of that it is. Again, that's in my links that I have, but it's a Western It's like a Western version of it. It's not that it wasn't there; it's that it appears in a completely different position than in these other manuscripts that we have, and that's a clear indication of some kind of interpolation, like either addition or changing in some way. The fact that it's out of place.
3 minutes.
Okay. You mentioned that in 2 Peter, just writing his name at the top of it, saying, "Hey, here I am. I'm Peter writing this stuff," is a clear indication that Peter wrote it. And I would say that in the early in the first century and even in BCE, it was a very common practice to author things in the name of other people in order for your what you were writing to have some clout, basically. So I would say that him writing it at the top doesn't really hurt my case at all, and it actually works with what we know writers to do in these eras. You pile on a lot of assumptions for 2 Peter, by the way, which I feel like sincerely violates, any kind of parsimonious criteria that you could hope to apply to it. And then you mentioned something about Herod, which I only wrote down Herod's name. I can't remember what you said about Herod. But anyways, you mentioned Pliny. True, with the eruption or the destruction of Pompeii, we only have Pliny's thing. But I see. Here's one thing: is that in historical studies in history, you have to question everything. Like with Tacitus and Suetonius, yes, we do only have a few copies of it, but that also means that we don't know what it says in a lot of areas. And I don't think the number of copies that we have necessarily translates to it being more reliable. I think that the fact that we're missing portions of Tacitus and whatnot from all of our copies, I think is what makes it unreliable. So I guess I'll cede the rest of my time.
Okay, perfect. You actually had a little over a minute left. So now we are going to go to the cross-examination portion. So I am going to take the white boxing off so that everybody can go back and forth. I will mute myself unless you two get on rolly. Don't make me roll any heads. The first person who's going to get to ask questions in this instance is going to be RC, who gets to ask questions to John. So your 10 minutes of question time will start now. Please go ahead.
All right. So first question I have is concerning the contradictions. So do you believe that if something contradicts in various historical accounts, should that mean that the story that occurs is false or unreliable?
I feel like if it does contradict, it kind of depends. It depends on like the time frame of the contradicting things. I think that a lot of things would need to be taken into context for it. But all things being equal, I think that if one thing contradicts another thing, then it doesn't mean that it is wrong or didn't happen necessarily. I think that it just renders it inert. Like it can't be used to assert that definitely is what happened. I think that it just renders it like a 50-50. You don't know which one actually happened without more evidence for either side.
Okay. So do you believe that the city of Rome burnt to the ground at some point in its history?
Well, yeah, I mean, we have people that record that.
Right.
Yeah.
So I want to go over some of that, since you mentioned that we do have people that record that, at least of 3 names that I have on mind. We have Suetonius that says, Nero openly sent men to burn the city of Rome in one account. Then you have Dio Cassius saying that Nero secretly sent these men in secret to burn the city of Rome. And then by Tacitus, he suggests that Nero may have not have actually been responsible at all for what had occurred. And then in another idea that shows conflicting accounts is that Nero watched the city burn from the tower of Maecenas. Roman history, if I'm Dio Cassius, says that Nero watched the city burn from his palace on the rooftops. And then Tacitus suggests that Nero was miles away in Antium by the time the specific event occurred. So we have three accounts that seem to contradict each other. Do you believe that in light of these contradictions, that this means that there's some unreliability in terms of the historical accuracy of the event, and that we should have doubts about the event?
No, I mean, I don't think that we need to have doubts about the event. I mean, the differences here, I would say, are relatively minor. I mean, it's Nero openly sent them, Nero secretly sent them. Of course, Tacitus, that one I know that we conflict on, and I've had many conversations about. But no, yeah, I mean, I would say that it's pretty reliable. I don't know if those are all of the sources, though. I don't know if we have
Right, there could be more.
Right. I don't know if there are other sources. I mean, I haven't looked into the validity of Rome burning in general, but I would say that like Rome burning or a city burning or whatnot is a natural event, and it doesn't take anything extraordinary. So it's fine to assume that happened, because like it would just be like me saying my house burned down in 1992. I mean, I don't know if you'd really be able to verify it, but it's not like I said a pink dragon shat fire on it and burned it up.
So I guess concerning that thing you mentioned, would you say that if a story if the author is a affirmer of miracles and includes miracles in the specific work that contains documentation of these accounts, should that mean we should discredit the reliability because of the person writing miracles within his works elsewhere?
I'm not exactly sure what you mean. Could you say it again?
Sure. So, for example, let's say you have someone like Matthew, and he writes of miracles and affirms miracles that occur in certain places, but he's also at the same time writing of places and events that occur. Should we discredit the historical reliability of these accounts that have been written because there are miracles within this specific work?
Well, no, I believe that you're kind of presenting a bit of a straw man here, because
Well, I didn't make a claim. I was just asking to clarify, to see if that was your position or not.
Well, no. I mean, but I'm saying that the question that you're asking here is a lot like, hey, when did you stop beating your wife? You know, I'm just saying that, like, the fact that if he writes about a miracle, he would need a lot of extraneous evidence in order to support that miracle happened. But just because he wrote about a miracle there doesn't mean that other things didn't necessarily happen. But I mean, it also affects it as to what is our external evidence for what is said. I would say that if he writes something, and then we have multiple other people that write something contradictory, normally in the historical method, you would go to the most attested and the earliest. So, I mean, it's kind of see, that's where in historical writings it's really kind of a toss up, and it's really just, oh, this guy's opinion versus that guy's opinion. And you can't really get to like an actual fact.
Right. I guess a simple question here. You mentioned Bart Ehrman's book concerning the citation of where you're getting most of the things, and mentioning the different manuscripts. Does the earliest manuscript of Luke, based on Ehrman's book or any other research you've done on that particular verse, does the earliest manuscript of this verse lack or contain verse 34?
Are you talking about the prayer?
The one where it says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Yeah, the prayer. From what I remember in my research, it was originally there, and then in some manuscripts later, it was taken out.
Can you remember the specific manuscript that did contain it?
No, I mean, I can't remember the specific manuscript. Sorry.
Okay, I'll take a look into it after the debate, because that's definitely interesting. So concerning anonymous authorship that you had mentioned, why would that be a problem for theological reliability?
Well, I mean, I don't think it necessarily said that the anonymous authorship Well, I guess I kind of did there in theological reliability. I said that with them being multiple anonymous authors. Well, the multiple anonymous authors doesn't really give us a way to analyze, like, who actually wrote it. And so I think that like my point there was just that we don't know who originally wrote these, so we don't know what actually was in them, because not only of that fact, but the fact that we just simply don't have them.
Okay.
2.5 minutes.
All right, thank you. I guess I'll just make this my last question. So you mentioned the issue of the number of people at the tomb. So wouldn't it be possible that it could just have been the maximum that is mentioned in one of the Gospels? Since, for example, in the case of John 20, which just at first mentions Mary Magdalene, it says that she went to go see it, but in verse 3, immediately, verse 2, actually, I'm sorry, when she reports back to the disciples, says, they have taken away the Lord of the sulfur out of the sepulchre, and we know not where they laid him. Couldn't that have indicated that while John's focus was on Mary, like probably the others, and focusing on the specific ones they named, they could still recognize that there's still multiple women that are with them?
Well, I think that particular line's a bit ambiguous, because I feel like the we portion could also refer to like we as a group, like they've taken them, and we like as a group don't know. So I don't consider that to mean like we as in me and my group of ladies here, my posse. We don't know where they took him. Like, I think she was more in a collective we.
All right, that's fair. I guess this will actually be the last question. Do you think it's possible that there could actually be more women that went to the temple than what is named in all 4 of the Gospels of that specific account?
Oh yeah, there could have been a whole Justin Bieber crowd following them over there.
Justin Bieber crowd.
I mean, I think that on a more serious note, I think that it I think there's no way to know exactly. I mean, could there have been more? Yeah, sure. I don't know how you would actually know if there were more. I mean, obviously, I don't think the incident actually happened, but I think that neither do the gospel authors. I don't think they actually know what happened, because at the tomb, you have multiple different theological interpretations of Old Testament scripture as to what was found at the tomb. So I don't think that they were recording history at that point. I think that they were just recording like a theological narrative in order to teach shit.
Okay. So we are at 10 minutes and 5 seconds. So that's pretty good. So now I am going to turn the table. So now, GE, it is your opportunity to ask questions that you may have for RC Apologists. And let me just reset. Your time starts now.
Okay. So I'm kind of curious, how do you reconcile like the time frame of the different birth narratives in the New Testament?
Define what you mean by I'm sorry, just to clarify, what you mean by the birth narratives in the timing?
Okay, well, Matthew, I believe, has Jesus being born sometime prior to 4 BCE, while Luke has him being born after 680.
All right. Well, concerning and what were they again?
4 BCE and 680.
Okay. Trying to think where they mentioned that.
I want to say Matthew, I think it was starting in chapter 2, and then in Luke, I want to say it's somewhere in 2. So I think Matthew spends the entire first chapter on John.
Well, I mean, unless I could see where it's saying that, they're clearly laid out in this specific BCE or BCE or
Well, I
AD.
mean, in the text it doesn't say that, but Herod dies in 4 BCE. So sometime prior to 4 BCE, the Gospel of Matthew says Jesus was born, and then in Luke you have in sometime after 6 AD, which is when Quirinius became the governor of Syria at the time, which is directly mentioned in Luke. You have Jesus being born. So I mean, there's a clear 10-year difference there. I mean, that's like a difference between 2000 and 2010.
Okay. Well, I mean, I still don't see like how, because you do say that, it's not there by saying, this was in 4 6 BC. As far as the things, I don't see where that's stating that there's.
Well, so I mean, does that mean that you think Herod could have the slaughter of the innocents and he's calling for it from his grave or something?
No, I don't think that he would be calling for it from his grave.
Well, right. So that's I mean, if Herod called for the slaughter of the innocents, because he got visited by the Magi, and the Magi said, "Oh, the king is born," and he's like all worried about the king, so he calls for the slaughter of the innocents because he's worried about this king. He couldn't have done that after his death. He would need to do it before his death. His death was in 4
Right.
BCE. So the logical conclusion here is that this particular section of Matthew, when Jesus was born, happened prior to 4 BCE.
Right. It's very possible that could be the case for that.
Well, no, I mean that's the only way that it could have happened with Herod.
Right.
I mean, it's fine if you don't have a good answer for why there's
Well, I
such a
mean-
big difference between the two, but
Well, I mean,
I
as
can
far as
guarantee you.
Mhm.
Go ahead.
I mean, as far as for the dating, and let's say like the birth of Jesus and such, I would hold to sort of a different view on when Jesus was born. Like some people do believe that he was born on December, like most people celebrate. But I, of course, maybe in slight years as well, have a difference in terms of what people traditionally ascribe to it based on some recent evidence and examination that's gone out. So I think it's very possible for Herod, to have been alive during the time of Jesus's birth and such. So in other words, Jesus was around that particular time of Herod before his death.
Okay, well then, I mean, that means that he couldn't have been born in Quirinius's time. So, are you trying to say that Luke is in fact incorrect as to the circumstances around Jesus' birth, and that Matthew is correct?
No, I don't see how there would be a difference between the two.
Well, I mean, Quirinius can't go back in time and rule Syria in 4 BCE.
What do you mean by Quirinius? Like the city, or
No, Quirinius, like the governor of Syria in 6
sorry
AD.
about that. Oh, sorry about that. Kind
Okay.
of ran out of tea, and now I'm a little tired. So, I mean, I don't see what the problem is concerning Quirinius. Then, I mean,
Okay, well, in Luke, Quirinius calls for a census, or not Quirinius, sorry, it's the Caesar at the time. He calls for a census, which we actually don't have evidence of that actually happening, where they call for a census and you have to go back to your ancestral home 1,000 years ago. But he calls for a census during the reign of Quirinius in Syria. He was appointed governor, and he wasn't appointed governor until 6 AD.
Well, I wouldn't have much knowledge on that particular subject. I hadn't not been told about that specific thing, but I hadn't put much study into that. I just simply focus on some other issues. So I wouldn't be doing any good on my side or yours to address that. So,
okay, well, can you tell me, when do you think that he was born?
Quirinius or Jesus?
Jesus.
I don't have any specifics on that. I think I've heard some people at least mention the month being September.
Okay, but you don't have an idea of the year.
The year, no.
Okay. All right, which I don't have any kind of qualms about the whole year thing. So what was your contention about Herod? Because I wrote down Herod and I forgot what you had said.
What concerning what Josephus recorded?
I guess so.
Well, Josephus, because you mentioned at one point, Herod ordering the slaughter of the innocents. But that's not the first time we have something where it was written by only one account, and nobody else. Especially the fact that it was affecting a large amount of people. Since a lot of people had lost their children during that time, why no one else wrote it? When Pliny the Elder had a relative that was there at during the time of the Pompeii incident. And I'm sure others had relatives that were there too, but nobody wrote anything about it. And Pliny's was a private letter that he was writing. It wasn't any public work that was trying to be sent out to the public. And he only mentioned it in brief passing because he had a relative that lived there. Then you have Josephus, who records where there is an order by Herod of the slaughter of Jews, not just simply children, but of Jews in general, and that he forced the canceling of the Passover. This would affect a lot of the Jews, but only Josephus records of this event. So my contention was, simply that if we're going to doubt the slaughter ordered by Herod, and only because it's mentioned in the New Testament, then we should be skeptical about the specific events mentioned by Pliny the Elder and Josephus, especially Josephus, concerning this other, I'm assuming different Herod. Don't know exactly the name or when this specifically was recorded by him.
Okay, well, I would say that in historical studies, anything that only has like one source for it or whatnot, I mean, it wouldn't be taken as 100% accurate. I feel like that's another thing that's being mistaken here, is that it's either 100% yes it did or no it didn't, and they work in degrees. Like, we can say that it probably happened. Now, unlike the volcano with Pliny the Younger and whatnot, or Pliny the Elder, unlike that with Herod, in the slaughter of the Jews, you have to overcome the obvious link to the Moses story. And you have to be able to prove that they didn't just make this up using Moses' story. So okay, I think I got time for one more question. What's your proof for the 99% like accuracy in remembering or transmitting the Bible?
Well, it's not about the memory, but simply the textual transmission. And so far, I forget. I know Inspiring Philosophy has posted that number, but it's not the only person I've seen that's gone over it. Daniel Wallace who is a textual critic that studies this and has opened the Center for the Study of New Textual Manuscripts, which, by the way, if you ever want to look at those, they also publish and show actual Greek or Latin manuscripts of the New Testament in their copies. But based on him and the other new textual critics that I usually look up, they always give that based on comparing the different textual variants that exist, 400 to 500,000. And so far, there's only 40 lines that aren't resolved by the science of textual criticism. So I guess based on what they're saying, the rounding up of the numbers, that's what we get in terms of accuracy and what's been solved.
Okay, you are 1 second less at this point than John was during you guys are impressive. Like clockwork.
It's like we're a match made in heaven.
I know. This couldn't be going more smoothly. You guys are fantastic. Thank you for being such honest and respectful interlocutors. So we are at the closing statement section. So we do already have super chat that we're going to need to ask. There are questions being accumulated in the chat. We're not going to keep you guys too long. I know, RC, you said you were tired. So the super chat will get priority. And then after that,
I'll be fine.
Okay, good. Because I could do this all night. This is fascinating. Not talking is hard for me. Everybody knows that, but I'm doing good. So now we are going to go to the closing statement. So I am going to white box you, RC, because you are first, and your time will start once I get the timer back up. All right, your time starts now. Please go ahead.
All right. Also, I just want to point out before I get to my closing statements that it's always nice that going through a debate, there's a nice synchronization and harmony, because every single time, it's like me and Shannon's phones have been in sync on the exact same time when she's been calling it out. So I don't know. I just find that very impressive. And also the fine-tuned argument for the existence of God, it's because me and Shannon's phones are in perfect sync. God's existence proven. but no, in all seriousness, thank you for this debate, Shannon, as well as Godless. I definitely love this format, and seeing Godless interact on this definitely shows a great deal of respect and maturity. And may I say, definitely am far more impressed than the first encounter we had on the Non Sequitur show. This definitely showed some great patience and skill of his. But I do want to also make some critiques and do give the case. I only have 3 minutes and 50 seconds to make it, but I think it's simple and easy. So on the side that I've seen from Godless, what we have are some assertions that are made based on, we have some manuscripts that we can see, but there's really not much that we can make other than some people can speculate and make up some theories without really much evidence other than, maybe this certain manuscript lacked it and then it was later added in, and then maybe, oh, guess what, this is why he added it in, or why it was removed, or something like along those lines. But I'm simply pointing out that we have the historical reliability based on other instances. For example, I wasn't able to get to this and I wish I could have, where you have Julius Africanus reporting of multiple people about the darkness that occurred during Christ's death. In the third book of Thallus, that mentions the darkness is due to an eclipse unreasonably. And Phleon said that during the time of Tiberius Caesar, an eclipse of the sun occurred during the full moon. So we have instances like that. Then you have, of course, as I mentioned, with the 500,000 textual variants of the 140,000 words. And with all of these, with a majority of these being solved, we have a 99.5% textual reliability of the New Testament concerning this, as well as most of these variants are just simply spelling mistakes and errors in grammatical rules of the Greek. And 9% of these changes come from much later manuscripts. So obviously we can see that these later changes, like Mark 16 verses 9 to 20 and John chapter 7 verse 53 to 8:11, are not part of the original text. So these are easily able to be dismissed and seen as not part of the text. But the 1% that affects the meaning that come from early manuscripts, again, aren't that much significant changes, like what was mentioned with Matthew chapter 6 verse 6 earlier. And in fact, the historical reliability of the New Testament mentions much more of these kinds of changes that are just like that. So people are aware of these, but even then, they say because of these, as even Bruce Metzger notes, that because we have so much of these, this actually strengthens the faith and the reliability of the New Testament as a historical document, because when we're dealing with textual criticism, as is even noted by Charles E. Hill in A Biblical Theological Introduction to the New Testament, that's the one thing they're looking for in terms of looking at any document. Rather you have the Quran, rather you have Suetonius, the works of Shakespeare, Josephus, Tacitus. When you have a good, even Homer's Iliad, when you have a good bit of these manuscripts and the textual variants, we can help find out what was the original reading and what was most likely it. So based on all these things, as well as the fact that we can go to also the church fathers in terms of pointing out the historicity of the attribution by people who were getting their information from eyewitnesses. I mentioned Irenaeus, who would have gotten his information from his teacher, Polycarp, who his teacher was John. So this idea is easily able to be seen in there. So I would just simply say this. Don't just take my word for it. Examine the manuscripts for yourself. Look into them. We have access. We are publicly letting you see this information, and we have published books on this stuff. Don't just take my word for it. Go and examine the evidence for yourself.
Okay. Thank you very much. So you went just slightly over, but some of that was talking about how awesome I am, so I'm going to allow it. And now, don't worry. If you want to talk about how awesome I am, I'll give you extra time too. So, John, your 5 minutes starts now.
Okay. I do want to thank RCA and Shannon. Shannon's been an excellent moderator for this. And I would like to think that I had a hand in how well this kind of played out too, with timing and stuff like that. But anyways, I would just like to reiterate how, textual reliability, I think I showed how the changes that are actually exist in the text, the text that we know from our earliest extant manuscript and codexes and whatnot, on through the ages of how they were changed. I think that can give us an indication of how often things were changing prior to that. Not exact numbers or anything, but we do know that it was happening, and was happening a lot. That, combined with the fact that in ancient history, people forged things in other people's names, and people freely changed things that weren't widely circulated at the time, because it would be easily accepted. And so with all of these things, I think that you can safely say that there were a lot of changes from the time that they were authored by people that we don't know, but we can say that they were changed from then to the point where we have actual extant manuscripts, codexes, and whatnot. I feel like the textual changes are not as minor as RCA likes to indicate. I gave a few examples for that. And while I would say probably a majority of the changes were simple spelling errors that maybe changed just a phrase to just be a different way or whatnot, I think that there's enough substantial changes in it to warrant knocking down the reliability of the text in general, because we don't know what was changed prior to our most recent or our earliest extant manuscripts, codexes, whatever. I think that there's enough doubt there for you to be able to say that it's not reliable enough. Now, I wouldn't go as far as to say 99 per, like, I'm not going to say it's 99% unreliable, but what I would say is that it's probably about 60% unreliable. And that I'm not going to go too much farther than that, because of the fact that theologically it's not reliable, but there's a lot of theology that is shared within it, and but theologically you can't trust it to give you what was actually meant by those first authors. And then historically, obviously, it's not reliable. I would say that it's more historically unreliable than it is reliable. Obviously, I give it more. I would say it's more, more like 80% unreliable in the historical reliability category, because any historical claims that are made in the New Testament has been proven to either not be that way or to be rendered inert by the fact that there's multiple versions of it that possibly didn't happen, or it's not attested outside of the Bible. So you can't say that it did happen. It's just, oh, this exists, and the probability is kind of 50-50, so you don't get any help either way. I would lean towards the side that says that it probably didn't happen, like the tomb probably didn't get rolled away by an angel. That's got a lot more things on top of it, though, than just there's nothing else that attests to it. That's got a miraculous thing going on there. But all of the historical inaccuracies of it lend to a more theological creation, a theological narrative, rather than actually doing history. And I would say that the historical unreliability of the Bible would be enough to give you pause as far as trusting the Bible to give you actual history. I think on that alone, you can't deem the entire Bible like unreliable, because it could still communicate the theology of it. But I think that with the vast landscape of the different theologies surrounding what Jesus supposedly taught and what people were wanting to teach using Jesus, I think theologically you can't rely on the Bible to actually give you like what Jesus would have wanted his ministry to be, or what he would have wanted to teach. This is all because of the amount of textual variants that we have, that we know of, and the fact that it would have been a lot more rampant in the earlier days. So, and I would say that I'm not like, while some of these are speculations and whatnot, that's what historians do. They speculate on different aspects of it given the evidence at hand. He mentioned Thales for the eclipse and whatnot, and I would say that they were probably getting their information from Christians and getting them from Christian sources because of the time period in which they were writing in.
Over time.
And time.
Yeah. Do you have
Okay.
a final statement?
Shannon is very pretty.
Yeah, perfect. That's the right one.
And
you
the
win.
Bible's
John
on
wins
the
the debate. I've declared John the winner.
Hey, what about me? I went longer with mine.
Whoever says I'm pretty last wins. That's the
Well,
rule.
That was Casey,
I'm
by the
incredibly
way.
shallow. Everybody knows that. Okay, well, Casey wins the debate.
To quote Donald Trump, this was rigged.
It was from the start. It was. I didn't tell anybody the real rules. These are the real rules. All right, so we have to start with our super chat questions. So Kent Hoven CPA sent $1, just sent $1, so thank you. The next question is from Drew Durant, and he said, why should I put my faith into any religion that has caused significant atrocities in the name of their God? Crusades, Spanish Inquisition, etc., etc.
I'd say that again. I don't know, the internet connection broke out there. I heard Spanish Inquisition and...
Oh, that one was a super chat from Drew Durant for $4.99. And he said, why should I put my faith into any religion that has caused significant atrocities in the name of their God? Crusades, Spanish Inquisition, etc.
Well, I would say that people will abuse almost anything for the sake of their own personal gain, whether it be religion, politics. For some people, even try to say, for scientific gain, to do things that could do some benefit for science, but at the same time are unethical in terms of the standards that they would use. I would say that truth is truth. Regardless, some people will abuse and contradict the means of which we're trying to get to something. So in terms of religion, with the Inquisitions, for example, these violated the principles of the Bible. That is why we had the Roman Catholic Church doing these things. In fact, during this specific time period, one of the popes, I believe, even stated that, he wanted to hear the people scream and cry in agony, because he believed that this suffering helped reduce their time in purgatory. Don't quote me on that. That's just simply a paraphrasing. But there were not exactly righteous people at the time. So when some people say in the name of religion, actually examine the religion itself and then compare it to these specific deeds. If something goes against it, then that should be a reason to follow the religion, not the specific movement or the atrocities that have been given. It may be the people that are in error, not the religion itself that is.
GE, do you have any response to the question that you'd like to add, or do you want to move on to the next one?
No, yeah. I would agree with RCA's first part of that just because people use something in a bad way to do bad things doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong or anything like that. And definitely you should believe something, not necessarily have faith in it, but believe in something if you can reliably prove that it's true. But I would say that what I'm against is the reverence that religion is given, and how a lot of people treat religion as if it can't be wrong, or you have to have religion, otherwise you're immoral. And I think that really is the heart of people using the whole why would I believe in this if people do horrible shit with it? It's because we've been inundated with this idea that you have to have religion in order to be good, or without religion everything goes to crap, or it's just immoral and murderous and all this other stuff. So I would say that be against the unverified faith, the faith without evidence. And I think that Christians still can believe in the theology of Christianity and be against all the horrible things that are done in it. And I don't really have a problem with that.
Okay, awesome. So the next question is actually for GE. I'm not sure who it's from, And also, thank you, Paul, for aggregating some of the chat questions for me. It makes it a lot easier. This question is this question is gone. This question is what makes a source more or less historically reliable? What would increase your confidence in the reliability of the New Testament?
Okay. Well, so what I would say is that there's a lot of factors that goes into validating or saying that a source is reliable. For one thing, is the time in between the event happening and the person that's writing it. I would say that that's a pretty big component, because if you have somebody that's writing a couple hundred years later that's attesting to something like in the first century, I would say that that's not very good evidence, because it's too far removed from when it happened. It would be a lot like me right now trying to verify, like me being the sole source for the Civil War. Or anybody right now being the sole source for the Civil War happening, or me claiming anything that happened in the Civil War, happened then, and me being the only evidence of it. That's one particular thing. Explanatory power is another. How well does it explain everything? And independence. It has to be independent of other sources. So if you can prove that it's independent of other things, then I think that makes it stronger. And in order for me to build my confidence in the New Testament, I think that I would need a lot stronger like resolutions to practical problems in it, like when was Jesus born, what happened when the tomb was when people found the tomb, things like that. I would need like more significant information that not necessarily is closer to the time that it happened, but has better explanatory power. And we just don't find that in history.
Okay, RC, do you have anything to add? The next question's for you.
No, I'm good.
Okay, so this question is from Gage Paragon, RCA. How and why do you distinguish between magic and miracles? The inclusion of Jesus?
Mm-hmm.
Are you sure that's enough?
So if I'm to understand the question correctly, I mean, what the inclusion between magic and miracles, I believe it would be the issue about specifically the source. With concerning magic, it wasn't necessarily, as far as my knowledge goes, concerning that it's coming directly from the gods or as the work of the god itself. But if you will, like magic is sort of a synergistic operation, where it's sort of a man-centered idea, where it tries to give and elevate man to a certain power. Whereas when in terms of miracles, it is strictly the work of God that these miracles occur. It is not by the specific people that the miracle occurs. It is specifically and strictly alone the work of God that these miracles occur. So I think that would be the distinction between the two.
Okay, that's fair. GE, do you have anything to add before the next question?
Yeah, I think that I think that you still haven't really distinguished between what is done like for the work of God and what would be magic. Because I mean, anybody can say anything's for the work of God. I mean, if I spit in somebody's eye now and they could magically see, I mean, and if I did it in the name of God, does that make it a miracle and not magic? You would still need to be able to delineate between, the magicalness of it, because magic is pretty much anything that happens outside of nature and natural things. Like any kind of magic, like any kind of act that happens that has no natural explanation would be considered essentially magic. So God is supposedly existing outside of that, and if he does something that violates the laws of nature, then there's no way to distinguish it from magic, other than the fact that the person's like, God says be healed.
All right. All right, fair enough. Okay, so there's time for a few more questions. Are you guys okay? Because there's a lot of questions. We got it down to about 3 more. Is that okay?
I'm fine.
Okay, awesome. All right. So if anybody has any super chats, send them now before everybody gets tired, but we're still aggregating. So this is from Paulogia. This one's for you, RC.
Hey, Paul.
Hi, Paul. So he says, do you agree that historical accuracy is a probability? What probability percentage Do you give examples like Pompeii versus probability percentage of the New Testament miracles? Why the difference? Is there any?
And what was the term you used? Historical what?
Do you agree that historical accuracy is a matter of probabilities? What probability percentage do you give examples like Pompeii versus probability percentage of the New Testament miracles? Why is there a difference, if there is any?
Well, I think for me, the New Testament miracles are in terms of, I'm going to assume by probability, I'm assuming means like a percentage thing. For that, I would say 100%, simply because I start with the presupposition of the Christian worldview, where that is part of my view. But as far as the Pompeii, I would suggest that, the event itself is 100%, but as far as some of the things that happened there, again, as I noted, we only have one writing of the account that seems to suggest some other things that the archaeology doesn't suggest. So I would say the same thing as I would say of others. It would be like a 98, 99% in terms of the accuracy and reliability of knowing what exactly happened concerning Pompeii.
Okay, yeah, because there's actual physical archaeological evidence for Pompeii,
Of
which helps
course.
to corroborate. Yeah. Okay. So, G, do you have anything to add?
I would just agree that history is about probabilities and what probably happened and whatnot. And I think that the evidence for Pompeii, is remarkably better than any of the miracles in the Bible, considering the miracles in the Bible have to overcome the fact that they are miracles and they need much better evidence than what they do have. Whereas, physical evidence for Pompeii, and percentage wise, I'd put Pompeii at like between 95 and 98% of that happening. And then, of course, the miracles of the Bible, I'd place it like maybe 1%.
Okay, perfect. Almost all of these questions are for you, RCA. So
Why am I not surprised?
I know, right? It's almost like my audience skews towards wanting to question your perspective more, but it gives you an opportunity to answer fairly. I hope you don't feel like you're being piled upon and you're being given opportunities.
No, in fact, bring more of them on.
Bring them on. All right, good. Okay, so doesn't your position? This is from Trevor Hudson, by the way. Thank you, Trevor.
Okay.
Or Trayvon. I'm so sorry, Trayvon. Doesn't your position still rely on faith?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't. To me, it would be foolish for me to say that most of the things that I rely on aren't faith. I mean, I think most of the things that we rely on are a bit based on faith, but it's not a blind faith. I still think there's some evidences to these things that we're going to, but we still start with some presuppositions when we examine the evidence, and we come to a specific conclusion after examining the evidence and the cases and the reasons that we have for believing or affirming something to be true. So yeah, I would still say that it's faith that I would still have concerning these things, especially for the miracles. I would still say that is even faith, because I start with the presupposition of believing in the Christian worldview that affirms these miracles.
Okay. All right, perfect. So G, do you have anything to add? Next question's for you, believe it or not. Someone's got a question for G.
No, I don't really have anything to add.
Okay, perfect. So this is from Jeremy Taylor. You're very passionate about this subject. Have you come from religion yourself? And if so, why did you leave?
I am passionate about it because I mean, I did come from religion. I started off as Catholic, then I moved into more Baptisty than non-denominational, and then back to Baptist a little bit, and then I finally left the faith in general. And to be quite honest, I really wasn't all that concerned with it, because growing up, it was just sort of a default position. God exists, the Bible's true, all this other stuff. And I guess I got really passionate about it because I started looking at it, and all of the things that I had just taken as innately true were crumbling, and it was like everything just started being wrong. And it's like, I don't know, it's so fascinating when you start finding out like all of these intricate like details about the Bible, how it was composed, and everything like that. And so that's what really got me like interested in it, and why I'm so passionate about it now.
Awesome. So We have one last question, and Caitlin Chloe would like to know if GE would like to have dinner with her.
The pressure.
Yes, honey, I will. I will have dinner with you right after I'm done.
You tell her to be patient. All right.
Patience is a virtue.
That's right. So I've heard. So I'm not. I have a little bit, or so I've been told. A little bit, not much. Not much. All right. Well, thank you both for being. This went fantastically well. I hope you both feel like you were represented well. I'd like to thank you so much both for instantiating what it's like to have like a really fantastically respectful two-way dialogue about what's generally a very contentious and emotionally charged subject for people. So I am very proud of both of you and proud that I was able to host both of you and that you were both such fantastic representatives of either of your respective sides. So thank you both. And thank you for also respecting each other's time and the time of myself and the audience. You were both very well prepared and it showed. So kudos to both of you. I tip my fedora to you, sirs, because that is fantastic. You both took this very seriously and it was easy to tell. Thank you very much.
No, yeah, and I just want to say that I really appreciate RCA for asking me to debate him on this subject. I feel like a lot of people are either scared or they talk a big game, and when I challenge to a debate, they either don't go through with it or whatnot. But I really appreciate it, and I really loved having the debate with you, RCA. And I mean, we're still bros,
Throw it out.
Throw it out. Indeed, we can be bros and still debate and have some strong disagreements on things.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
100%. You guys are fantastic examples. So thank you very much for that. The links, if you provide them, both of you had referenced some links earlier. If you provide them to me, I will make sure that I insert them into the description. So if somebody wants to come back and check later, I may not be able to add them until tomorrow morning. But if you're watching this stream later, the links that they reference should be in the description. If they were provided to me, I'll make sure that they get there. So thank you to both of you. The links to your channels are in the description. And also, like, I have a Patreon and a Twitter or whatever. So you can do that too. That's down there. I'm just garbage at promoting myself. All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, chat. Thank you, everybody who supports the channel. And again, thank you both to RC Apologist and to GE. And bye, guys.